Of course, Vibeke is from the Centre for Drug and Alcohol Research. If you look through some of her publications, she's got some wonderfully intriguing articles on nitric oxide usage and use, and cannabis growing in Denmark, all kinds of extremely interesting topics that she'll cover. But today it's about addiction beyond the individual is the title. And I think Vibeke is going to talk about social contexts, which are of course very interesting to many of you sitting here today. With that said, Vibeke, thank you so much for agreeing to give a talk, and we'll get started.
Thank you, Christine. And thank you all for coming. I really look forward to be able to present some thoughts and reflections that I have on addiction, which is a concept that sort of comes up in many of the research projects that I am working on and have been working on, together with another concept, which is intoxication, but that I will not say a lot about today. So even though Christine said a little bit about me and my research, I think it might be helpful to just say a little bit more in order to let you know what kind of research interest that I have. I've mainly done research on alcohol and other illegal drugs like heroin and cannabis. My research has focused on consumption of alcohol and other drugs, on policies in relation to substances, especially drug policy, but also what is often called institutional sociology, focusing on treatment and other welfare institutional offers for people who use drugs and how these are practiced by professionals and other stakeholders. So, trained as an anthropologist, I have also mainly done qualitative research with a specific focus on drug and alcohol users' own perspectives on their substance use and everyday lives, as well as treatment professionals and other stakeholders' perspectives on their work practices. So this said, I will be moving on to addiction. And I should have changed the PowerPoint now, but it is done, so here we are. So addiction is about consumption, but excessive and harmful consumption of, for example, alcohol, illicit drugs, tobacco or sugar, or excessive consumer behaviors in relation to shopping, gambling, gaming, or sex. New forms of addiction has developed and increased the number of people who are addicted. So we see all these different kinds of new forms of addiction that has sort of come to our attention within the past decades or more. So one could say that addiction is the undesirable side of our contemporary consumer societies and causes severe problems for individuals as well as society. Addiction in general has been characterized by individuals' experience of loss of control over certain forms of consumptions or behaviors and manifested as craving. So while most theories of addiction include loss of control and craving as an important characteristic about addiction, there are also different and varied understandings of the causes of addiction, and therefore also different rationales or understandings of addiction. And I will start this talk by introducing some of the most dominant models or understandings of addiction. And by doing this, I also emphasize and acknowledge how addiction research is a multidisciplinary field of research. But while most theories of addiction atomize the individual from social relationships and wider social and cultural contexts, my point of departure is that we as humans always are embedded in relationships. So what I do in my research is to investigate the different sorts of relationships that persons with a drug use or an addiction is embedded within, and what frames or make and remake these relationships, and therefore also the addiction. So what I hope to do today with this presentation is to show what a focus on relationships and wider social and cultural contexts can offer into multidisciplinary research on addiction. And while this focus might challenge some of the dominant understandings of addiction, it does, on the other hand, not offer a final solution to this phenomenon. The fact that addiction research is multidisciplinary points, in my opinion, to the complexities of addiction and addictive behaviors. There are no simple explanations. And I hope to show that we can unfold some of these complexities of addiction by focusing not only on the individual, but also on relations and social and cultural contexts. So today, I have divided my talk into two major parts. In the first part, I will introduce some of the most influential models and understandings of addiction, followed by some of the what I call the basic logics that is embedded in these models. And I do this since these understandings have particular effects and will be referred to in the second part of my talk. And in this part, I will unfold what a focus on relationships and social and cultural contexts can offer to the addiction research field by focusing on two topics. The first is political pharmacology, and the second is recovery from addiction with or without treatment. And with these two topics, I explore how social relationships, institutional contexts, and society at large both affects but also co-constitute addiction and addictive behaviors. And I will go, of course, into details later on on these two different topics. But this is just to outline what you can expect of this talk today. So it might be useful to say out loud that even though there are several different concepts beside addiction that are used to define excessive consumption of substances like substance use disorder, dependence, harmful use or problematic use, addiction has turned into a global and influential concept that is used not only within research but also in politics and in society as such to define excessive consumption patterns and behaviors. So that is why I foreground addiction as a concept today, but we can of course go back to some of the other concepts in the Q&As later on if you're interested in that. So addiction is a concept that is, among other concepts, to define excessive consumption of substances, but there are also these different kinds of models of addiction. There's not just one. So currently the most influential of these models is the neurobiological models of addiction, and especially the model developed and promoted by NIDA, the National Institute of Drug Abuse in the US, that defines addiction as a chronic relapsing brain disease, has gained foothold not only in the US but also worldwide. And this understanding of addiction is based on MR scans and brain research that the now long-term director of NIDA, Nora Volkov, some of you might have heard of her, she has argued that drugs hijack the brain and disrupts and damage the dopamine reward system, followed by craving and compulsive behavior. But the individual is not to blame since the brain is hijacked, and this hijacking of the brain does not differentiate, as Volkov has pointed out repeatedly. Any one of us can get addicted. Other definitions of addiction is based on behavioral, psychological or learning theories, where addiction is understood as bad habits that can be learned and unlearned by changing behavior. In these models or understandings, addiction arises because certain activities are powerfully rewarding and become more so through exposure. These theories are especially based on lab work and on rats' exposure to a particular intoxicant, for example morphine or cocaine. And the idea is that continuous behavior such as drug taking creates states of craving and low impulse control, and that these continuous behaviors, often not understood as reflective choices or self-conscious decisions, but as habitual behaviors, these turns into addiction and what is then also called addictive behaviors. So a final model of addiction I will emphasize here is developed from inherited disposition theories based on, for example, genetic research to find the or those genes that predispose some individuals to addiction and others not. In this model, also the Minnesota model can be placed, and perhaps some of you know about the Minnesota model by having heard of AA, Alcoholics Anonymous, or NA, Narcotics Anonymous. In this Minnesota model, some individuals are more disposed to become addicted than others, and the analogy to allergy is used here, not genetic models, but sort of an analogy to allergy. Like some individuals are more disposed to allergy than others, and so is it also with addiction. And then I have put others on the slide also because these are not the only models of addiction, but I will argue that they are the most widespread and influential understandings of addiction. And I would also like to say I know I have presented these models really shortly, and that they are of course a lot more complex when unfolded in details, each of them. But my point here is that there are different models of addiction, and while there are substantial differences between these models of addiction, there are also similarities. And these similarities are that they all operate with loss of control as an important element of addiction. But what causes the loss of control differs and are placed in the brain or in these non-reflective habitual behaviors or in the genes and so forth. In all models, the point of departure for addiction is also the individual and or the individual body or particular parts of the individual body, leaving both relationships and social and cultural context undiscussed or at least backgrounded, as well as they to a very large extent omit individual agency. So on top of these similarities, another similarity between these different models of addiction is that they promote treatment as the solution to the problem, and hence also tap into a more overall problem understanding of addiction developed historically. Several scholars such as Conrad and Snyder, as are here, I put them on the slide, in their book From Badness to Sickness, Medicalization of Addiction, or Nancy Campbell's book Discovering Addiction, or Harry Levine in his now classic article The Discovery of Addiction, have shown how addiction came to be understood as a disease and started to be couched in medical rather than moral terms. Important points in all their analysis are that medicalization of addiction and the shift from understanding problem drinking or drug taking as deviant behavior to understand it as a disease is more a social and political accomplishment than outcome of medical research. A basic problem understanding has therefore developed historically that addiction is a disease and that treatment is a solution to this problem. Treatment, however, is a very wide concept and can be many different things based on inpatient or outpatient offers, organized by private or public institutions, including medical substitution treatment with, for example, methadone for opioid addiction, joining the Alcoholics Anonymous movement, or having antabuse prescribed for alcohol addiction, or being offered cognitive therapy or motivational interviewing for cannabis addiction by counselors in addiction treatment. But the basic logic is that in order to recover from addiction, some kind of treatment intervention is needed. And no matter what the method used is in treatment, the aim is to make a change back to an individual in control, most often with abstinence as the goal, whether this is with or without being medicalized with a pharmaceutical for shorter or longer periods of time. In the models that I presented before, cure is not an option. Only continuous abstinence from using substances or getting lifelong assistance is defined as a way of coming out of treatment. So there are these dominant and influential understandings of addiction, primarily focusing on the individual, that because of the loss of control is not able to be self-agentic in order to get back into control, but need help to do this. Combined with the definition of addiction as a disease, this makes treatment the obvious solution to the addiction problem. And on these notes, I will continue to unfold what research that goes beyond the individual can offer to the understanding of addiction, but also how these influential understandings of addiction have particular effects into the context and relationships that persons with an addiction is embedded within. So it might seem a little bit disconnected to social and cultural context, but these logics and rationales are important also in relation to the next part of my talk. Yeah. So I will start out with political pharmacology. And in Denmark, as in most countries in the world, substances used for intoxication is divided into legal and illegal substances. Alcohol and tobacco is legal in Denmark, while heroin, cocaine, cannabis, ecstasy, amphetamines, methamphetamines, cat, and so forth are classified as illegal drugs. The political decisions about which substances are legal and which are illegal are, however, not based on how harmful the substances can be or their addictive potential, but on political decisions. Some illegal drugs like cat and ecstasy have a very low addictive potential and used in the right way, not particularly harmful. Alcohol and tobacco, on the other hand, is some of the substances that are most harmful, especially in relation to health. So the division into legal and illegal substances has therefore also been conceptualized as political pharmacology. So why is this important? And it is for at least two reasons. First, when substances are categorized as either legal or illegal, they are also subjected to different kinds of laws, regulations, and politics. Legal substances like alcohol can be produced and classified into products with low, middle, or high levels of alcohol. Advertising can be regulated, harms of alcohol use can be studied, and prevention advice can be offered by health authorities on quantities and frequencies of use if harm should be avoided. This is not possible with illegal substances. These are only available on the black market or illegal market. They cannot be informatively labeled in relation to content and strength. For example, mild versus less harmful forms of cannabis with low THC versus stronger forms of cannabis with high THC and THC being the main active intoxicating ingredient in cannabis. It is impossible, or at least very difficult, to advise on how to use an illegal substance, in what quantities and frequencies, in order to avoid harms. And on top of that, people who use illegal substances are per se engaged in criminal activities simply by the drugs or substances being illegal. So drug policies, including political pharmacology, therefore creates particular spaces that anyone in illegal substance use is unavoidably placed within and have to navigate in different ways. An example of this can be drawn from a study I have done on small-scale cannabis cultivation, as Christine mentioned, together with colleagues. Important results of this study was that the participants' motives or motivations for growing cannabis, even though growing cannabis is illegal in Denmark, was to avoid the black market and criminal networks involved in illegal drug dealing, but also importantly to be able to know the strength and strain of cannabis they used. So by growing cannabis themselves, they were taking care of their health and were able to control their access to cannabis and not being dependent on criminal networks. So second, and in continuation of the first, it becomes difficult or almost impossible to distinguish between harmless consumption of substances and harmful consumption that can lead to addiction, which we can do with alcohol, but which is almost impossible when we talk about illegal substances. So all use of illegal substances become problematic and is feared to lead or potentially lead to addiction. And this has a huge impact on people who use drugs recreationally. And by recreationally, I mean that they use in moderate quantities, only occasionally, and most often in particular settings or period times of their lives. So in a study based on qualitative interviews I did also together with colleagues, I usually work in teams. So when I refer to the research I've done, it's mainly research I've done with colleagues. But this research was on adult recreational cannabis use, and it was evident how the participants' cannabis use was narrated in relation to avoiding stigma and avoiding social and illegal sanctions related to using an illegal drug. They did so by hiding their cannabis use from their children, extended family and work relations, and in the interview narratives it was therefore evident that the participants juggled with norms and values around what was acceptable and unacceptable use or good and bad use of cannabis. That these reflections were mainly invoked by the mere fact that cannabis is illegal, and it was not worries about if they used too much or too often or was in risk of developing a harmful use or an addiction. So cannabis use became a moral, not a health issue for these adult recreational cannabis users. So the harms of illegal substance use is not necessarily related to the risk of becoming addicted, but instead to the political condition that some drugs are illegal. Because with this follows also disbelief in that an individual can have a controlled and harmless consumption of illegal substances. And this disbelief is represented to a very large extent by health authorities and treatment professionals, but also often by friends and families. And this creates then different kinds of harms than addiction or or health harms of using a substance, an illegal substance. And these harms are, for example, shame, being forced to keep a part of one's life secret, marginalization and exclusion from social relationships, social services intervention in relation to one's children, getting a criminal record or even getting incarcerated and so forth. So again, drug policy and the political pharmacology it is based upon creates different spaces for drug use, but also for potential harms of drug use that is not necessarily related to the drug and its addictive potential, and the related possible harms of using it. So what I want to emphasize here with all this talk is that drug policies co-constitute how we define and shape our understanding of addiction, but also that this has particular effects on individuals as well as welfare services aiming at helping people out of addiction, as I will move to now. And just in this move towards treatment and welfare institutional office, I would like to repeat myself and say that recovery or getting out of addiction is closely connected to treatment. Treatment is considered the solution to the addiction problem. The dominant models of addiction that I presented earlier also recommend that people with an addiction is offered treatment. So, but what happens in the black box of treatment, and why is it that most people get out of treatment get out of addiction without treatment? And I will talk about that first, recovery without treatment. So in the literature, getting out of addiction without treatment has been conceptualized as maturing out, spontaneous remission, self-change, or natural recovery. And this means, all these different concepts means that people with an addiction has not entered treatment but have stopped using drugs on their own. And we have evidence for this from longitudinal representative population studies, especially from the US, that include instruments to measure respondents' levels of substance use and whether they are reporting an addiction or not by, for example, using the DSM criteria that are often used also in clinical practice to measure levels of substance use. And since these studies are longitudinal, they can follow individuals over time and therefore also be able to show how addiction, including heroin and cocaine addiction, for a great number of respondents in these studies are time limited and resolved on its own. They are not chronic and relapsing. So research on recovery from addiction without treatment is, however, or unfortunately, very limited. And therefore we know very little about how and why these processes out of addiction happens without treatment. But one possible explanation is that people who get out of addiction without treatment are less socially, economically, and mentally burdened than people who seek treatment for their addiction. But also actually that their substance use is connected to particular life circumstances and contexts, and that changing life circumstances makes people change their drug use, also when it comes to heroin and cocaine forms of drug use that can be defined as addiction. And I'm mentioning heroin and cocaine because I think it is considered some of the most potent and addictive substances that are possible to use for intoxication within the group of illegal substances. But this points to contextual circumstances as highly important when people quit using drugs, also when their drug use can be defined as an addiction. And perhaps this is not that surprising, maybe, since we know that all kinds of both legal and illegal substances or substance use is a highly social practice embedded in particular social and cultural contexts and relationships. So, research I've done with colleagues on young adults' alcohol consumption, especially with Maria, who sits down here, for example, show how deeply embedded this consumption of alcohol by young people is embedded in friendship constructions, party practices, general youth culture, gender norms, ideas of how to mature and becoming an adult, belonging, and so forth. And this was also evident in a study I did also with colleagues on young people who used drugs and at the same time were in contact with the criminal justice system. These young participants were very drug experienced, had used intensively, including combining different kinds of illegal substances, but they also narrated how their drug use was a social practice and done in drug-using networks. So this suggests that change in relationships, life circumstances, and social contexts can also constitute an option for change in substance use practices. So, turning towards recovery from treatment, or from addiction with treatment, recovery with treatment, I will take a point of departure in substitution treatment with methadone from heroin addiction. And this is methadone treatment or substitution treatment with methadone is probably the most extensively researched substance use treatment form ever. And consistent results from this sort of body of research on methadone treatment is that patients in substitution treatment are burdened in a very long or wide range of different ways. There is a high comorbidity with psychiatric disorders, high levels of experience of physical and sexual violence, low levels of education and affiliation with the labor market, high levels of living in poverty and growing up in socially marginalized families, high levels of histories of addiction in the family, and so forth. So
what was that associated with recovery?
It's patients in substitution treatment with methadone, or it's usually methadone, but other pharmaceuticals has.
So those patients are so associated with the things you just listed,
yeah,
and not recovery.
Well, they are. You know, when you make a profile of this treatment population in methadone treatment, you will see this.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah. High levels of comorbidity, high levels of poverty, high levels of addiction in the family, and so on, as a characteristic of that population, which is very different from sort of the general population, and which links to what I was saying about, even though we don't know a lot about it, but what I was saying about people who get out of treatment get out of addiction without treatment, that they are less burdened in these ways with comorbidity, socially, economically, and so on. Yeah. Yes, and if there are questions, please just interrupt and go on with that. So just to continue a bit with this, follow-up studies also show that patients either are in lifelong medical assistance with methadone, or that patients get in and out of treatment. So when addiction research is done on treatment populations, it can therefore be easy to find results that support the understanding of addiction as being chronic and being relapsing, and relapsing related to loss of control. And that a person with heroin addiction is either needs this lifelong assistance in treatment or need to become abstinence in order to keep in control. So I will go on a little bit and talk about some results from my own research, and it's results from qualitative research I've done on patient in substitution treatment with methadone and for heroin addiction. And these studies I've done show that going in and out of treatment is caused by frustration with how the treatment is organized and what is demanded by these patients as when they are in treatment. So the relapse into active heroin use is therefore by these participants narrated as an active choice, since they would rather be in active heroin use than fitting into a particular treatment regime. They narrated how being in treatment was frustrating because methadone should be taken supervised by an addiction nurse, which made them feel distrusted and disempowered, because opening hours were too short, usually a couple of hours in the morning, and hence too rigid, because the treatment clinic was designed in a way that they had to line up together with other patients in order to get their methadone, which made them visible and on display as an addict for people passing by, and they found that very humiliating, because they had to show up every day at the treatment clinic to get their medication, and most were not allowed to get take-home doses for a couple of days or a week, meaning that they had to spend a good deal of their day getting to the treatment clinic to receive their medication. And finally, to mention here, it was also frustrating that they were not allowed to take half a dose of methadone in the morning when they came, and then get the other half of the dose with them home. And while the full dose could get them through to the next day without withdrawal symptoms, they would also get very drowsy when they got a full dose in the morning. And they preferred to be more clear and awake after being medicated, and this was possible if dosage was divided into 2 and not 1 daily doses. So furthermore, these studies also showed how treatment staff related to their patients were of utmost importance for the participants in not just the studies of substitution treatment with methadone I've done, but also in other studies I've done with patients in drug-free treatment. The participants emphasize appreciating when professionals are open-minded and respectful, non-judgmental and non-patronizing, and when they took a point of departure in the participant's specific situation and need. Experiencing otherwise when professionals were just doing their job or just following rules, the experience was that the professionals didn't really care. So the rules and regulations in addiction treatment, how treatment is organized, and the way professionals approach drug users in treatment have huge impact on drug users' motivation for staying in treatment. So addiction embed people in different sorts of relationships, for example, when being in treatment, through which the conditions of people's addiction is created and recreated. So the examples here can nuance our understandings of loss of control and relapse into active substance use, and suggest that an inclusion of relations constituted in addiction treatment and the organizational and political context of addiction treatment can help us understand what the causes of loss of control and relapse also are, and perhaps even start us to think about these concepts in slightly different ways. So, summing up, Studying addiction with a focus on relationships and social and cultural contexts from substance users' own perspectives emphasize that the effects of substances are not inherent to the substance itself, but is relational and shaped by the contexts of use. It depends on quantities and frequencies of use, mode of administration, reasons for use, spaces where substances are taken, social and cultural norms around substance use, drug policies, and so forth. With this follows also that drugs do not affect individuals in the same way and do not become addicted in the same way. So one could also say that addiction does discriminate and is related to poverty, comorbidity, growing up in deprived neighborhoods, family histories of addiction, and so forth. And therefore addiction is co-constituted by the biographical, political, and socioeconomic conditions that people are embedded within. It also emphasizes that substance use treatment co-create particular understandings of addiction and addictive behaviors, and that these institutional contexts might be experienced as more difficult and compromising than being in active drug use. So focusing on drug users' own perspectives of being in treatment not only informs us about how we could possibly improve treatment offers, but also challenges concepts like loss of control and relapse as exemplified here. So focusing on first-person experiences and perspectives can inform us of different experiences and perceptions of what living with addiction and what is experienced as harms or problems when being addicted. Furthermore, existing understandings of addiction, which derive mainly from treatment populations, do not necessarily capture all processes out of addiction. We might learn a lot from researching further how people get out of addiction without treatment, and perhaps also question whether addiction necessarily is chronic, requiring abstinence or lifelong assistance in order to stay in control. So sayings like once an addict, always an addict, or just don't do it might not resonance with the experiences that some people have with substance use, and especially recreational substance use. And perhaps if we understand these experiences better, it will also inform us about how we can prevent processes into addiction and not just treatment to recover from addiction. So finally, before Q's and A's, if we include a focus on relationships and social and cultural contexts in research on addiction, we can also investigate how addiction and treatment as its solution does not only say something about the addicted person who is in need of treatment, but also about our society as a whole and how we deal with problems like addiction. So thank you all for listening, and courtesy to Track Aarhus and Unsplash for photos. Yeah.